The plantation stood several miles outside Richmond, positioned deliberately between isolation and access. Far enough from the city to avoid routine scrutiny, close enough to supply its markets, it functioned as a self-contained system governed by custom, violence, and routine enforcement. Tobacco fields stretched outward in measured rows, their layout designed for efficiency and control rather than convenience. Dirt roads cut through the land, pressed flat by decades of forced labor, connecting the fields to the curing sheds, barns, and storage buildings. At the center rose the main house, elevated and clearly visible from nearly every working area. Its placement was not accidental. From most points on the plantation, one could see it, and from it, much of the plantation could be surveyed. Surrounding the main house were the outbuildings, slave quarters, and the punishment yard, all positioned so that labor, rest, and discipline existed within the same visible frame. Nothing about the layout suggested privacy. Everything about it suggested observation. Daily life followed rules that were rarely written and never questioned. Movement required permission, either explicitly granted or informally tolerated. Speech required judgment, especially when spoken near wide authority or those known to cooperate with it. Mistakes were corrected quickly, sometimes publicly, sometimes in ways designed to leave no visible mark but a lasting lesson. Overseers carried whips, but more often they relied on presence, tone, and reputation. Violence was not constant, but it was always possible, and its unpredictability was part of its effectiveness. People learned to anticipate it not by logic but by instinct, reading faces, watching gestures, listening to changes in voice. Within this system, the boy occupied a position so minor it bordered on invisibility. He was small for his age, somewhere between 12 and 14, though no record existed to confirm it. He had been assigned to light work early, not because of kindness but because he moved quickly and followed instructions without resistance. His tasks included carrying water to the fields, delivering messages between buildings, sweeping curing sheds, and running errands that allowed overseers to avoid unnecessary movement. He knew the plantation paths better than many adults, knew where the ground softened after rain, where ruts formed, which fences could be crossed without noise. He knew which dogs barked and which attacked, which buildings were avoided after dark, and which men drank before noon. He spoke only when spoken to, answered briefly, and lowered his eyes when addressed. These behaviors were not taught formally but acquired through repetition and consequence. When he had spoken too much once, he had been struck. When he had looked up too long, he had been reminded not to. Over time, silence became habit, and habit became protection. On most days, his value to the system lay in being unnoticed, in passing through spaces without interrupting them. Despite this, he observed constantly. Observation was not curiosity but survival. He learned who enforced rules strictly and who improvised. He learned which overseers punished without warning and which followed procedure. He learned which enslaved people had limited trust, who carried messages for the overseers, who relayed information in exchange for protection. He learned how authority moved, how it shifted depending on who was present, and how quickly circumstances could change. The plantation's hierarchy was rigid but functional. The owner was rarely present, his influence arriving through letters and instructions enforced by others. The manager oversaw operations with a focus on yield, order, and reputation. He concerned himself with numbers, schedules, and appearances rather than individual suffering. Beneath him were the overseers, men given broad discretion to maintain control. Among the enslaved population were drivers and domestic workers who occupied a precarious middle position, trusted just enough to be useful and despised just enough to be expendable. Everyone else adapted as best they could. The boy had learned early to avoid the punishment yard, even when passing near it was unavoidable. The post at its center was worn smooth by repeated use, the ground around it packed hard and darkened. It was not always occupied, but it was never neutral. He did not stare when passing. He did not need to. Short fragments of memory followed him through his work. The sound of someone crying out years ago, the feel of a hand gripping his shoulder too tightly, pulling him back into line, a night when raised voices in the quarters had been cut short without explanation. These memories did not form a coherent story. They emerged as physical responses, tightening his chest at certain tones, quickening his pace when certain men were nearby. He had learned to survive by waiting, watching, and complying. The routine shifted one morning in a way subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed by someone less attentive. The manager arrived earlier than usual, riding in from the main road with two overseers following close behind. His posture was rigid, his expression controlled but tense. He spoke quietly with the overseers, gesturing toward the curing sheds and then toward the outer sections of the property. Orders followed quickly. Workers were reassigned without explanation. Paths that were usually open became restricted, and tasks were adjusted in ways that suggested urgency rather than planning. The boy was sent with a message to a barn near the edge of the plantation. The errand itself was not unusual, but the timing was. As he moved along the outer path, he noticed a group of men gathered near a storage shed that was typically kept locked. One overseer stood watch while others worked quickly, their movements tense and deliberate. Their voices were low but sharp, carrying an edge he recognized. When one of them noticed the boy approaching, he raised his hand abruptly and ordered him to take a different route. The boy complied immediately, turning without question. However, the alternate path curved behind the shed, where the ground dipped slightly and brush grew thicker. From that position, he could hear more clearly. He slowed his pace, not out of curiosity but because the tone of the voices signaled danger. He remained behind the brush, unseen, and listened. The men were arguing quietly but urgently. Words like mistake, witness, and can't have this cut through the air. One of them spoke a name the boy recognized, belonging to someone who had not returned to the quarters the previous night. There was movement inside the shed, a sound that did not match the others. The boy did not understand everything he was hearing, but he understood enough to know that it involved harm and that knowledge itself was dangerous. He backed away carefully, ensuring the brush did not move, and returned to the main path. He delivered the message as instructed. No one questioned him. No one mentioned the shed. Yet the rest of the day carried a different weight. Eyes lingered on him longer than before. A driver who usually ignored him asked where he had been sent that morning. An overseer who had never spoken directly to him before instructed him to remain closer to the central buildings after sunset. That night, sleep came in fragments. He lay on his pallet listening to whispered conversations that stopped when he shifted. Someone asked a question he did not answer. Someone else told them to be quiet. The plantation felt alert, as if holding its breath. Over the following days, control tightened incrementally. Movement was monitored more closely. Tasks were reassigned without explanation. The boy's errands were shortened, his routes restricted. He was kept closer to areas under direct supervision. He did not ask why. He noticed, however, that the overseer who had turned him away from the shed watched him carefully. The man's expression was not openly hostile. It was calculating, as if measuring risk. One afternoon, while returning tools to a barn near the main house, the boy overheard two domestic workers speaking quietly. They assumed no one was listening. One mentioned that someone had run. The other replied that this was always the explanation. The boy did not know who they meant, but the implication was clear enough. Later that evening, an older man who worked in the field sat beside him during the meal. The man spoke without looking at him, his voice low. He told the boy to keep his head down and avoid places he had not been sent. The advice was not new, but hearing it spoken confirmed what the boy already sensed. Something was wrong, and it involved him. The first formal response came a week later, when the boy was instructed to report to the manager's office. No reason was given. Inside, the manager sat at his desk, papers arranged precisely. An overseer stood near the door. The questions were simple and carefully framed: where the boy had been sent, which paths he usually took, whether he had seen anything unusual. The boy answered truthfully but narrowly, careful not to volunteer information. He had been sent to the barn. He took the path he was told to take. He saw nothing unusual. The manager studied him in silence before dismissing him. As the boy turned to leave, the overseer warned him that curiosity caused trouble. Outside, the air felt heavier. The boy did not know whether his answers had satisfied them, only that the questions themselves signaled concern. From that moment, pressure became constant. He was assigned work near the punishment yard, placed under closer watch, denied small freedoms he had previously earned. Among the enslaved population, reactions varied. Some avoided him. Others watched him with fear or curiosity. One whispered a warning. Another cautioned him not to trust anyone. Late one afternoon, he was instructed to carry a crate of tools to a remote area near the edge of the property. The task itself was ordinary. The location was not. The crate was heavier than necessary. As he walked, he thought of the shed, the voices, the names spoken in anger, the questions in the manager's office, the warning from the older man. When he reached the designated spot, no one was there. He waited. Footsteps approached from behind. This was not yet the moment of violence, but it was the moment before it, the point at which the system determined that a problem could no longer be managed quietly. The boy turned, aware that whatever followed would not be undone. The first spark had already been lit. The plantation was closing in. What followed the incident at the edge of the property did not arrive as a sudden escalation but as a gradual tightening that made ordinary routines feel staged and provisional. The plantation did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it became more orderly, more deliberate, as though the system itself had recognized a flaw and was adjusting to correct it. Movement was tracked with renewed attention, tasks reassigned with little explanation, and informal permissions quietly revoked. The boy noticed that errands he once ran freely now required verbal confirmation, that doors previously left unguarded were suddenly watched, and that overseers lingered longer in places where they had once passed through quickly. Nothing dramatic occurred, but the absence of overt violence was itself a warning. It suggested planning. The consequences of what he had seen began to surface in indirect ways. A man who worked in the curing sheds disappeared from the quarters without announcement. No punishment was witnessed, no explanation offered. The next morning, the manager informed the drivers that the man had been sold south. The statement was delivered flatly, as a matter of logistics. No one contradicted it, but no one believed it fully either. The timing was too close, the silence too complete. The boy understood that this was how the plantation handled inconvenient facts, by replacing them with official versions and enforcing those versions through repetition. Pressure began to concentrate around him personally, though rarely in ways that could be protested or proven. He was kept within sight more often, assigned tasks that placed him near overseers or within range of the main house. When he finished work early, he was given additional chores rather than dismissed. At night, he noticed that one of the drivers positioned himself near the quarters entrance longer than usual, watching who came and went. Conversations among the enslaved population shifted in tone. People spoke less openly, and when they did speak, they chose their words carefully. The boy was no longer simply unnoticed, he was quietly isolated. His responses to this pressure revealed more about him than any internal reflection could have. He did not attempt to run, despite knowing paths that led beyond the property. He did not seek protection from others in authority, knowing that authority was the source of the threat. Instead, he adjusted his behavior incrementally, becoming more compliant, more precise in his movements, less visible in his reactions. When spoken to, he answered immediately. When ordered, he complied without delay. He avoided lingering, avoided eye contact, avoided any action that might suggest defiance or fear. This was not passivity but calculation. He understood that the system punished unpredictability more harshly than obedience. At the same time, fractures began to form among those around him. One of the younger drivers, who had previously ignored the boy, began to ask questions under the guise of concern, inquiring where he had been sent on certain days and whether he had noticed anything unusual. The questions were framed casually, but their focus was narrow and persistent. Another enslaved woman, who worked in the main house, warned the boy to be careful whom he spoke to, implying without saying it outright that information was being traded. These interactions were brief and cautious, but together they revealed that the plantation's internal balance had shifted. People were choosing sides, or at least choosing strategies. Rumors began to circulate, though never openly. Some said the missing man had been caught stealing. Others suggested he had been punished privately. The official explanation, that he had been sold, was repeated often enough to sound rehearsed. The boy understood that rumors served a function. They created noise that obscured truth and made certainty dangerous. To believe the wrong version was to risk punishment. To know the correct one was to risk worse. The overseer's behavior reinforced this atmosphere. They became more present, more involved in minor details. One began inspecting work that had previously been delegated. Another took over tasks usually handled by drivers. Their authority was no longer relaxed. It was alert. When they spoke to the boy, their tone was measured, neither cruel nor kind, but watchful. They did not accuse him of anything. Accusation would have required proof. Instead, they treated him as a variable to be controlled. The first explicit test of his silence came during a midday break, when he was summoned by an overseer he had not interacted with before. The man questioned him about the outer paths, asking which he preferred and why. The questions were framed as casual conversation, but the boy recognized the strategy. He answered in general terms, emphasizing that he followed instructions and used the routes he was given. The overseer listened without interruption, then dismissed him without comment. The exchange left the boy shaken, not because of what had been said, but because of what it implied. His movements had been noticed, recorded, and analyzed. As the days passed, the plantation's response became more coordinated. The manager issued new rules regarding movement after sunset, citing concerns about theft and discipline. These rules applied to everyone, but their enforcement focused disproportionately on those who had reason to know more than they should. The boy found himself escorted on errands that had once been solitary. When he asked why, he was told it was for his own safety. The explanation was thin, but it was sufficient to end the conversation. Among the enslaved population, fear manifested in different ways. Some avoided the boy entirely, unwilling to be associated with him. Others offered quiet support, sharing food or advice without drawing attention. One older woman told him to remember everything, even if he never spoke of it. The comment was not framed as encouragement or instruction, but as an observation about how knowledge survived when it could not be recorded. The conflict became impossible to ignore when the boy was publicly reprimanded for a minor error he had not committed. The punishment was not severe, but it was conspicuous. It served as a reminder that he was vulnerable and that consequences could be imposed at any time. The message was clear: compliance would not guarantee safety, but resistance would ensure punishment. He understood that the system was narrowing his options deliberately. Faced with this reality, the boy confronted his first significant moral choice, though it was not articulated in abstract terms. He had to decide whether to continue suppressing what he knew in the hope that silence would eventually make him irrelevant, or whether silence itself was now a liability. The plantation's actions suggested that his mere knowledge, regardless of whether he shared it, was considered a threat. This realization shifted his understanding of survival. It was no longer enough to endure quietly. Endurance alone did not resolve the problem he represented. He chose, for the moment, to remain silent, but not passive. He began to observe with greater focus, noting who spoke to whom, who avoided whom, and how authority moved through the plantation. He paid attention to the manager's schedule, the overseer's routines, and the patterns of enforcement. This was not preparation for escape, which he still considered too dangerous, but preparation for understanding. He needed to know how decisions were made, who made them, and how quickly they were enforced. The plantation responded by escalating its measures subtly but decisively. The boy was assigned to work near the punishment yard more frequently, a placement that served both as intimidation and convenience. From there, he could be monitored easily, and the presence of the yard reinforced the consequences of noncompliance. He noticed that overseers lingered longer when he was present, as though waiting for something, an admission, a mistake, an opportunity. The tension reached a new level when he was summoned again, this time by the manager alone. The meeting was brief and formal. The manager informed him that his work would be reassigned temporarily, citing concerns about efficiency. The reassignment placed him in closer proximity to storage areas and outer buildings, locations associated with what he had witnessed earlier. The decision was presented as routine, but its implications were unmistakable. He was being positioned deliberately, either as bait or as a problem to be resolved. In the days that followed, the boy sensed that a decision had been made about him, even if he did not yet know its details. Conversations stopped when he approached. Overseers conferred quietly, glancing in his direction. The plantation's order remained intact on the surface, but beneath it, urgency had replaced patience. The system no longer sought to manage the situation indefinitely, it sought to conclude it. The final warning came not from authority but from someone within his own community. A driver he trusted only marginally pulled him aside and told him, without elaboration, that he should be careful in the coming days. The warning was vague, but its seriousness was unmistakable. It confirmed what the boy already suspected. Silence had bought him time, but time was running out. By the end of this phase, the conflict had shifted from latent to active. The boy's knowledge, once accidental, had become a liability that the plantation could no longer ignore. The system's response had moved from observation to preparation. The choices available to him had narrowed, and the consequences of inaction had become as dangerous as those of resistance. The first irreversible steps had been taken, and whatever followed would not be undone quietly. The plantation was no longer testing him. It was preparing to act. The shift from pressure to action did not announce itself through chaos or raised voices. It arrived instead through coordination. Orders were issued calmly, routines adjusted with practiced efficiency, and individuals selected for specific roles without explanation. From the outside, the plantation appeared to function as it always had. Fields were worked, sheds were filled, meals were distributed. Inside the system, however, a decision had been made, and that decision concerned the boy. He sensed it not because anyone told him, but because uncertainty had been replaced by intent. Where before there had been watching and testing, there was now direction. His reassignment brought him closer to the outer buildings again, including storage areas that were normally handled by older workers. The explanation given was efficiency. The real reason was control. He was being moved into spaces where fewer people passed, where authority could act without witnesses, and where explanations would not be required. The boy recognized the pattern immediately. He had seen others disappear this way before, though rarely someone his age. The fact that he was young did not protect him. It made him easier to manage. The overseer's behavior changed subtly but decisively. One stopped addressing him directly, issuing instructions through others instead. Another took a sudden interest in his physical condition, asking whether he was strong enough to carry heavier loads. These questions were not expressions of concern. They were assessments. The boy responded carefully, neither protesting nor exaggerating. He understood that appearing weak invited replacement, while appearing strong invited exploitation. Balance was essential. Among the enslaved population, fear hardened into resignation. People avoided being seen with him, not out of cruelty but necessity. Association carried risk. Those who still spoke to him did so briefly and indirectly, offering warnings without specifics. One woman told him not to argue if he was sent somewhere unusual. Another advised him to remember landmarks if he ever found himself alone. These comments were not plans for escape or resistance. They were acknowledgments of danger without solutions. The plantation's authority figures did not rush. They prepared. Tools were moved. Schedules adjusted. A remote area near the edge of the property was cleared of routine work under the pretext of soil repair. The boy noticed these changes because he had been trained to notice patterns. He recognized that certain locations were being entered deliberately, that certain paths were no longer used, and that certain overseers appeared more frequently near those areas. Each adjustment on its own was unremarkable. Together, they formed a structure. The moment came in the late afternoon, when the heat had driven most workers back toward the central buildings and shadows lengthened across the fields. The boy was instructed to carry a crate of tools to a location near the cleared area. The crate was heavier than usual, awkwardly balanced, and sealed in a way that suggested it had been packed quickly. The instruction came from an overseer whose authority he did not question, though the man avoided meeting his eyes. No escort was provided. That omission was deliberate. As he walked, the boy's thoughts remained focused on procedure rather than panic. Panic would have led to mistakes. He reviewed what he knew: the paths, the landmarks, the distance from the quarters, the time of day. He noted that no one else had been assigned nearby. He noted the absence of routine sounds. The plantation was quieter than it should have been. When he reached the designated spot, the area was empty. The ground had been disturbed recently, though not enough to draw attention from a distance. He set the crate down and waited, as instructed. Waiting had always been safer than questioning. Minutes passed. The light shifted. Footsteps approached from behind, measured and deliberate. He did not turn immediately. He did not run. He had learned that sudden movement provoked response. The overseers did not explain themselves. They did not accuse him of anything. They acted as though the decision required no justification. He was seized quickly, efficiently, without unnecessary force. His arms were restrained, his mouth covered to prevent noise. The process was practiced. This was not improvisation. This was procedure. What followed was not a public punishment. There were no witnesses, no formalities. The intention was not correction but removal. He was brought to the disturbed ground and forced down. The earth was loose, dug hastily, the pit shallow but sufficient. There was no speech about discipline or obedience. Words were unnecessary. The system did not explain itself to those it erased. The attempt to bury him alive was not accompanied by cruelty for its own sake. It was practical. The overseers worked quickly, shoveling earth with urgency rather than anger. Their concern was not his suffering but the completion of the task before attention could be drawn. In their haste, they made mistakes. The pit was not as deep as it should have been. The earth was not packed evenly. They assumed, as the system often did, that the boy's small size and lack of strength would be enough to ensure the outcome. They left without ceremony. What followed was not miraculous survival, nor was it driven by sudden strength or clarity. It was the result of miscalculation. The soil, loosely packed, shifted unevenly. Air pockets remained where they should not have. The boy's restraint loosened as he struggled, not violently but persistently. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but instinct intervened. He had learned, through years of quiet endurance, how to conserve energy, how to slow his breathing, how to focus on small actions rather than the whole. Time passed without measure. Pain, pressure, and disorientation blurred together. Eventually, through effort that was neither heroic nor dramatic, he found space enough to move, to push, to create an opening. When he emerged, it was not into safety but into shock. The world above ground appeared altered, as though he was seeing it from a distance. He lay where he was, unable to stand immediately, understanding only that he was alive and that this fact alone constituted a problem for those who had acted against him. His return to the plantation was not triumphant. It was quiet, unplanned, and deeply unsettling. He appeared at the edge of the cleared area hours later, dirt-covered, unsteady, and visibly injured. The first person to see him did not react immediately. The sight contradicted expectation. Word spread quickly but discreetly. The system, which had assumed resolution, was forced to adapt. The reactions among authority figures were immediate and fractured. Some responded with panic, others with anger, and a few with calculation. The overseers involved understood the implications. The boy was no longer merely a witness to a crime. He was evidence of an attempted erasure. His survival transformed the situation from a contained problem into an active threat. Decisions that had been made privately now carried the risk of exposure, not necessarily to external law, but to instability within the plantation itself. Among the enslaved population, his survival produced a different response. Fear intensified, but so did awareness. The fact that he had returned alive disrupted the narrative of inevitability that sustained the system. It did not inspire rebellion or hope in any overt sense, but it altered perception. People whispered about it cautiously, uncertain whether speaking of it increased or decreased danger. The boy became a living contradiction, proof that the system was not infallible, even if it remained dominant. Physically weakened and under constant watch, the boy understood that his position had changed irrevocably. Silence no longer guaranteed survival. The attempt on his life demonstrated that inaction was interpreted as threat. He also understood that speaking openly was impossible. There was no authority within the plantation that could be trusted to act justly. The question was no longer whether to speak, but to whom, and how. He made a decisive choice that could not be undone. Rather than appealing upward within the formal hierarchy, he confided selectively in someone positioned at the margins of authority, a person close enough to hear rumors, distant enough to avoid direct involvement, and vulnerable enough to understand the cost of truth. This choice was not framed as resistance or justice. It was a calculation shaped by necessity. He shared only what was required to ensure that his knowledge could not be entirely erased, even if he himself could be. This act shifted the balance. Knowledge began to exist outside of him, however tenuously. The overseers sensed the change immediately. Their behavior grew harsher, less controlled. Surveillance intensified. Punishments increased in frequency, if not severity. The plantation entered a state of heightened alert, driven not by external threat but by internal instability. The moral question that had hovered in the background now moved to the center. Survival alone had proven insufficient. The boy had survived an attempt to silence him, only to discover that survival itself intensified the threat he posed. Silence preserved life temporarily but perpetuated the system that had tried to kill him. Speaking risked immediate consequences but disrupted the certainty on which that system depended. As the days following his return unfolded, it became clear that the plantation could not absorb this contradiction indefinitely. Authority demanded resolution. Fear demanded control. The actions taken against the boy had escalated the conflict beyond quiet management. Whatever followed would not be hidden, not entirely. The system had been forced into motion, and its next move would determine not only the boy's fate, but the shape of power within the plantation itself. The approach to the climax was no longer gradual. The line between survival and justice had narrowed to a point. Choices remained, but each carried consequences that could not be reversed. The plantation was preparing for confrontation, whether it acknowledged it or not. By the time the plantation moved toward resolution, the process no longer resembled quiet correction. The system that had relied on routine and intimidation now faced instability generated from within, and instability demanded decisive action. Authority consolidated itself visibly. Overseers met more frequently, no longer disguising their coordination as coincidence. The manager altered schedules again, concentrating labor near the central buildings while leaving outer areas deliberately sparse. The purpose was twofold: to limit movement and to control who could witness what followed. The plantation did not prepare for justice, it prepared for containment. The boy was no longer treated as a peripheral figure. His presence altered conversations, disrupted routines, and forced decisions that had been postponed. He was kept under constant watch, though not confined. Confinement would have acknowledged the seriousness of the situation too openly. Instead, he was assigned to visible labor near the punishment yard, a reminder to others of consequence and to him of proximity. His injuries from the burial attempt were noted but not treated beyond what was necessary to keep him functional. Pain was not the point. Compliance was. Among the enslaved population, fear reached a new intensity. The boy's survival, once whispered about with disbelief, became a warning. People understood that the system had tried to erase him and failed, and that failure had consequences for everyone. Some withdrew further into silence. Others watched closely, calculating what allegiance or neutrality might preserve them. A few, carefully and briefly, passed information, times, movements, overheard remarks, not as a coordinated resistance, but as fragments of awareness that accumulated around the boy whether he sought them or not. Authority responded by narrowing the field of trust. Drivers were questioned. Domestic workers were reassigned. Anyone suspected of relaying information was moved or threatened. The plantation's hierarchy compressed inward, placing decision-making power in fewer hands. The overseers directly involved in the burial attempt pressed for swift resolution. Their interest was not order but self-preservation. The manager, concerned with reputation and stability, hesitated only long enough to assess risk. External exposure was unlikely, but internal unrest was dangerous. A visible, decisive act would reassert control. The plan that emerged was not officially articulated, but its shape became apparent through action. The boy would be confronted publicly, accused of misconduct unrelated to what he knew, and punished in a way that demonstrated authority without inviting questions. The purpose was not to extract truth but to discredit him. If he could be framed as disobedient, unreliable, or unstable, his knowledge would lose weight. Silence would follow, not because it was enforced absolutely, but because belief would be undermined. The confrontation was scheduled deliberately, timed for maximum visibility. Workers were gathered under the pretext of a routine address. The punishment yard was prepared, its presence unavoidable. Overseers positioned themselves strategically, controlling access points and sight lines. The boy was brought forward without explanation. He understood, from the arrangement alone, that this was not a private correction. This was an assertion of power meant to resolve uncertainty. The manager addressed the assembled workers with measured authority, speaking about discipline, order, and the dangers of disruption. He did not name the boy initially. He spoke instead about responsibility, about how rumors weakened productivity, about how obedience protected everyone. The language was familiar, but the context sharpened its meaning. When the boy's name was finally spoken, it was in connection with minor infractions, disobedience, wandering without permission, spreading confusion. None of the accusations addressed what he knew. That omission was intentional. The system did not intend to debate truth. It intended to define reality. The boy was given an opportunity to speak, not because his words mattered, but because the appearance of fairness reinforced authority. He understood this immediately. Speaking openly would invite swift punishment and discredit. Remaining silent would confirm guilt. The choice presented was false, but the consequences were real. He chose neither complete silence nor full confession. Instead, he spoke narrowly, acknowledging small errors without accepting the larger narrative imposed on him. He did not accuse. He did not deny. He described events only as they had occurred to him in terms too limited to be dismissed as fabrication, yet too incomplete to constitute an overt challenge. This response disrupted the script. The overseers had anticipated defiance or collapse, either of which would justify escalation. What they encountered was restraint. The boy's words neither satisfied nor provoked. They created ambiguity where certainty was required. The assembled workers watched closely, aware that something was unfolding beyond the surface accusations. The manager recognized the risk immediately. Ambiguity allowed questions to persist. The response was swift. The manager cut the boy off, declaring the matter settled. Punishment was ordered, not excessive but unmistakable. The act itself was less important than its symbolism. Authority would not be questioned publicly. The system asserted itself through action rather than explanation. The punishment was carried out efficiently, without spectacle beyond what was necessary. The boy endured it without resistance, understanding that resistance would escalate consequences not only for himself but for others. What followed was not resolution but fracture. The punishment did not restore order, it exposed strain. Among the overseers, blame circulated quietly. Some argued that the boy should have been removed entirely. Others cautioned against further action that might draw attention. The manager weighed these positions against the plantation's stability. He understood that killing the boy outright carried risks, not because of law, but because disappearance invited speculation. Survival with discrediting was preferable. The system adapted again, not toward justice but toward damage control. The boy, physically weakened and under increased restriction, recognized that the confrontation had changed his position irreversibly. He had survived an attempt on his life and endured public punishment. The system had declared him manageable, but its actions betrayed uncertainty. He was now both contained and dangerous. His continued existence required explanation, and explanation required control. The final escalation emerged not through overt violence but through betrayal. Someone he had trusted marginally, someone who had offered warnings and fragments of information, was pressured into cooperation. The system did not demand loyalty, it demanded survival. Information was extracted selectively, distorted through retelling, and presented as evidence of the boy's unreliability. The betrayal was not dramatic. It was procedural. The effect, however, was profound. It isolated the boy further, undermining the fragile network of awareness that had formed around him. This betrayal prompted the critical confrontation. The manager summoned the boy privately, accompanied by overseers whose presence signaled finality. The meeting was framed as resolution. The boy was informed that his reassignment would become permanent, that his movements would be restricted indefinitely, and that any further disruption would result in consequences beyond discipline. The language avoided explicit threats, but the implication was clear. This was an ultimatum disguised as administration. The boy understood that this moment defined the boundary between survival and erasure. Acceptance would mean continued existence under conditions designed to suppress memory and speech. Refusal would invite removal. There was no path to justice within the structure presented. Justice, if it existed at all, would exist outside the system's acknowledgement. He responded with a final act that did not seek permission. He confirmed, calmly and precisely, a detail known only to those involved in the earlier crime. He did not elaborate. He did not accuse directly. He demonstrated knowledge. The effect was immediate. The overseers reacted with visible alarm. The manager's composure faltered. The system had been confronted not with accusation, but with evidence of its failure to erase. The consequences were swift and irreversible. The meeting ended abruptly. Orders were issued. Surveillance intensified further. The plantation entered a state of control crisis. The boy was removed from visible labor, not to protect him, but to limit exposure. Rumors spread rapidly, despite efforts to contain them. The knowledge that he knew, and that he could demonstrate it, destabilized authority more effectively than any overt rebellion. This confrontation marked the climax of the conflict. Power had asserted itself through violence, discredit, and betrayal, yet it had failed to achieve certainty. The boy had not won, but neither had the system fully prevailed. The cost was visible: increased fear, fractured trust, and a plantation operating under the weight of its own actions. The darkest aspect of this moment lay not in physical suffering but in the recognition that cruelty functioned as policy, not deviation. The system did not act out of malice alone, but out of perceived necessity. Its horror lay in its efficiency and its capacity to justify itself. By the end of this phase, the outcome was no longer a question of immediate survival. It was a question of legacy. What would remain of what had happened, and who would carry it forward, could no longer be controlled entirely by authority. The confrontation had resolved the core conflict not through justice, but through exposure of limits. The system had acted, and in doing so, had revealed its vulnerability. The aftermath would determine what that revelation meant. The days following the confrontation unfolded without announcement, as though the plantation were attempting to return to equilibrium through repetition alone. Work resumed on schedule, fields were tended, tools distributed, and meals served at the usual hours. To an outside observer, nothing appeared altered. Within the plantation, however, the effects of what had occurred lingered in altered behaviors and unspoken adjustments. People moved more cautiously, spoke less freely, and watched authority more closely than before. The system had reasserted itself publicly, but its internal confidence had been shaken, and that instability manifested quietly, in ways that could not be addressed through punishment alone. The boy did not return to his previous routine. His reassignment became permanent, though the specifics shifted frequently enough to prevent predictability. He was kept away from the outer buildings, removed from errands that allowed movement across the property, and confined to labor that placed him under direct supervision. This restriction was not framed as punishment. It was described as efficiency, as protection, as necessity. The language mattered. By avoiding overt acknowledgement of conflict, authority sought to erase its significance. The boy understood that his survival depended on compliance with these conditions, but he also understood that compliance did not equate to safety. It only delayed further decisions. Physically, he recovered unevenly. The injuries from the burial attempt healed enough to allow work, but pain remained, particularly when he exerted himself. No medical attention was offered beyond minimal intervention. His condition was monitored not out of concern but utility. As long as he could work, he would be kept alive. This calculation was implicit and unspoken, but it shaped every interaction. He was no longer merely insignificant, he was contained. Among the enslaved population, reactions varied according to proximity and risk. Some avoided him entirely, unwilling to draw attention. Others acknowledged him with brief glances or quiet gestures that conveyed recognition without commitment. A few, cautiously, passed along information about changes in routine or shifts in authority, not because they expected action, but because sharing knowledge felt necessary. The boy became a reference point rather than a leader. His experience altered how others understood the boundaries of the system, even if it did not change their behavior openly. Rumors persisted despite efforts to suppress them. They circulated without fixed form, altered through retelling, stripped of specifics that could be punished. Some versions emphasized his survival, others the attempted punishment, others the fear among overseers. The truth fragmented as it spread, but the fact of disturbance remained. The plantation could enforce silence, but it could not fully control memory. Stories adapted to survive, becoming less precise but more resilient. Authority responded by tightening discipline selectively rather than universally. Punishments were administered for minor infractions, reinforcing control without acknowledging cause. Drivers were rotated. Domestic workers were reassigned. The manager reduced visible interaction with the enslaved population, delegating enforcement to overseers whose loyalty had been tested. These changes stabilized operations temporarily, but they also reinforced the sense that something had gone wrong. The plantation functioned, but it did so under strain. The boy's internal state shifted gradually. He did not experience relief after surviving. Survival had proven insufficient to restore normalcy. He understood now that justice, as a concept, did not operate within the boundaries of the plantation. What existed instead was management of risk. His existence represented unresolved risk, and that risk would be managed as long as it persisted. This understanding did not lead to despair so much as clarity. He adjusted his expectations accordingly. Despite restrictions, his knowledge could not be entirely contained. He did not speak openly of what had happened, but he did not deny it when approached indirectly. He corrected false details quietly, ensured that certain facts remained consistent, and allowed the story to exist without ownership. This approach minimized immediate danger while preserving accuracy. It was not resistance in a traditional sense, but it was not surrender either. It was maintenance of truth under constraint. Weeks passed. The plantation settled into a new rhythm that incorporated heightened surveillance as routine. For those in authority, the incident became something to be managed rather than resolved. It was referenced indirectly in decisions about staffing and discipline, but never named. For those without authority, it became a cautionary example. The boy's survival did not inspire rebellion, but it altered calculations. People became more aware of how knowledge functioned, how silence could be both protection and vulnerability, and how systems relied on belief as much as force. The long-term consequences were subtle but persistent. Trust among the enslaved population shifted, not toward unity, but toward guarded awareness. People measured words carefully, recognizing that betrayal was often a function of pressure rather than character. The plantation's hierarchy remained intact, but its moral authority, such as it was, had eroded slightly. Overseers enforced rules more rigidly, compensating for uncertainty with procedure. The manager focused on output and compliance, avoiding situations that required explanation. The boy remained alive, which in itself constituted a form of outcome. He was not freed, not vindicated, not publicly acknowledged. His survival did not dismantle the system that had attempted to erase him. What it did instead was insert a contradiction into that system, one that could not be fully resolved. He existed as evidence of both the system's power and its limitations. Over time, his story entered the plantation's oral memory in altered forms. Younger children heard warnings about certain places and certain tasks. Adults referenced an incident without details, using it to explain caution or restraint. The specifics blurred, but the lesson persisted. Silence was enforced, but it was never absolute. Truth could be suppressed, but not eliminated. It adapted. The moral question that underpinned the entire sequence remained unanswered within the narrative of events. Survival had proven possible, but it had not delivered justice. Speaking had disrupted authority, but it had not produced accountability. The system absorbed the disturbance and continued. Yet the cost of absorption was ongoing tension and diminished certainty. The plantation endured, but it did so knowing that its control was contingent rather than complete. For the boy, this understanding shaped his future actions. He continued to observe, to remember, and to adjust. He did not seek martyrdom, nor did he retreat into total silence. His existence became an act of endurance that carried memory forward without spectacle. He understood that history was not preserved through official records alone, but through accumulation of experience shared cautiously over time. The story does not conclude with resolution in the conventional sense. There is no reckoning that satisfies moral expectation, no restoration of balance that compensates for harm. What remains instead is a question posed by the events themselves. If a system depends on silence to sustain cruelty, what happens when silence fails but justice does not follow? The answer, as demonstrated here, is not collapse, but strain. Systems persist, but they do so imperfectly, carrying the weight of what they have attempted to erase. In the context of American slavery, this outcome is neither exceptional nor isolated. It reflects a pattern in which survival and truth coexist uneasily, neither sufficient on its own to dismantle oppression. The boy's story endures not because it altered the system decisively, but because it exposes the cost of maintaining it. It reminds the audience that history is shaped not only by victories and defeats, but by unresolved tensions carried forward through memory. The final legacy of the events lies not in official acknowledgement, but in the persistence of knowledge. What was seen could not be unseen. What was survived could not be undone. The system continued, but it did so having revealed its reliance on denial. That revelation, however limited, constitutes the story's lasting impact. The question left to the audience is not whether the boy did enough, but whether survival alone can ever satisfy the demands of justice, and what responsibility remains when truth is known but unacknowledged.